Good morning, everybody. This is Professor Konai Helu-Theeman. She's going to talk to us today about Pacific cultural and natural heritage, and especially how much they're interconnected when you look at it from a Pacific point of view. So this unit is all about Pacific connections to land, to sea, to the environment. They're not necessarily separate. So we'll be discussing that throughout this week. Also, we'll be discussing conflicts in relation to extraction of resources of land and sea, in relation to the significance of land and sea in the environment to Pacific people, and the complex situation that creates. So without further ado, I'm going to give it to Professor Konai Helu-Theeman.
I see a lot of blank chairs up here.
Well, we can all move forward.
No, I didn't mean for you to move. I wanted to, that's the beginning of my lecture. When I first came to USP and used this theater, I come to work and to give a lecture, and everyone was sitting where you are sitting, and there were no chairs up here. So I went back and I complained to one of my Fijian Itauke colleagues, and he said to me, you know, in Fijian Itauke culture, the further away you are from the chief or from the speaker or from a person of authority, the higher the respect that you give them. So I said, a good one. I thought he was kidding until I supervised a PhD thesis of an Itauke student, and she wrote about traditional knowledge in her community, and she said this, and she said, in this community, they are famous for weaving these huge mats that you see people put on their floors. And these mats are put down when there is a meeting between the chief and his people. And the bigger the mat, the higher the respect one assumes. She ended her thesis by saying, nowadays we make very small mats. And that, to me, shows the changes that's happening in Pacific cultures. This may be about mats, but it's also about heritage. So today I'd like to just remind us of some Pacific notions of heritage, and also towards the end to suggest that we are changing our notions of heritage for many reasons, some of which you already know. Now, I'm looking for the up and down button, but I don't see it here. Oh, okay. So here are some of the things I would like to cover. But before that, I want to, a show of hands, please put your hands up if English is your mother tongue. English is your mother tongue. No? Okay. Good. Because you will not have any difficulty relating to my lecture. Because this lecture is about Pacific perspectives of heritage, and language is your mother tongue, your vernacular language. That is the language of your heritage. So we are here talking about you and your heritage. So we'll have a look at some definitions. We go through this list, which I'm hopeful we should be able to cover. So these definitions are important, more for me than for you, because in many disciplines that are not science, pure science, we have to define what we mean before we start talking, right? Because we have different ideas about what things mean. If you are a scientist and you're doing biology or physics, and somebody talks about a molecule, you're not going to say, excuse me, sir, what is a molecule? Because scientists already know the definition of a molecule. All right? But when we talk about things like culture, education, in the social sciences and in the humanities, we have to define what we mean because we don't all agree on a particular definition. So these are words that I will use in the lecture, but this is the way I define it. This is what I mean, okay? So culture, for me, is that, a shared way of life of a people, including their knowledge and value systems, expressed in their language, okay? Different people have different definitions of culture. Heritage, the sum total of a community's attributes or wealth inherited from previous generations. I put tangible and intangible there because in Pacific vernacular languages, there is no distinction. In Tongan, for example, we say koloa tuk whakaholo. All right? Koloa is another word for wealth. So heritage, in using the term koloa, you put value on the heritage. It's not just any kind of heritage. It's heritage that is wealth, that is important. Tuk whakaholo simply means passed over generations. Think of the word in your language for heritage. Epistemology, for me, it's knowledge and value systems, which is part of heritage. And it's very important. This is important for a community's worldview. Indigenous people, first people of the land. UNESCO says indigenous people is people of the land who are minorities in their own countries. That's the UN definition of indigenous people. Well, I don't define it like that. I say first people of the land, whether they are majorities or minorities. First people, okay? Traditional knowledge is indigenous knowledge plus local knowledge. Throughout the Pacific, we have indigenous people plus more recent settlers. They have developed their own local knowledges. So when you have indigenous and local knowledges together, UNESCO calls that traditional knowledge. And the resource is interesting because in the social sciences, nothing is a resource unless it is used. Right? So those of you who take geography or environmental studies, a resource is not a resource. So if you look out there and there are a few trees out there, they are not a resource unless somebody comes, cut them down and make timber out of them. Okay? So what I say, resource is heritage that has potential to be used. And this is important for your future modules on conflicts in terms of resource use and heritage. So the context of the Pacific that we are talking about, and you are part of that context. It is not something out there that we are talking about. We're talking about us in the Pacific. Okay? One distinct feature of our region is its cultural diversity. Probably one of the most culturally diverse regions of the globe. It's also one of the most aided region of the globe. Lots of cultures and languages. So think about that and heritage. If each culture has its own heritage expressed in its language, we're talking about hundreds of different notions and ideas about heritage. So what do we get from learning about heritage? What's the rationale? Why you have heritage in this course? Think about why it's important to learn about heritage. The late Prime Minister of the Cook Islands once said that if you don't know where you came from, you wouldn't know where you're going. So it is important for us to know something about our own past, our heritage, and what we now think is our heritage and how those aspects of our heritage have changed. We also live in a region where there are very, very old cultures. We're not talking about a few years, we're talking about thousands of years. And think about that period and how our ancestors have adapted, okay, to the times, their resilience, and whether their lives were sustainable or not. However, we also know that Pacific cultures have been impacted hugely by many, many events or eras. The two that we usually refer to are colonialism and globalization. If you're historians, you would know the details of that particular bullet point. They impacted our heritages, marginalized our knowledges and our value systems, particularly our learning, the way we learn, the way we were taught, and our sustainable livelihoods. To such an extent that in some places there were fears that whole cultures and peoples would be wiped out, and some were, and some may be in the future. However, we now have opportunities to have conversations such as this about our heritage. Some examples of those opportunities came from the UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and most recently, that should read 2007, and the Sustainable Development Goals, there's 17 of them. And you probably hear people talking about Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17, and different Pacific countries have signed up to that. There were 8 Millennium Development Goals, which ended, and then taken over by Sustainable Development Goals. Many of our countries did not meet the goals of the Millennium. There were 8 of them. Now we have 17. So good luck to our countries for achieving the goals of 17. The targets, implementing the targets of 17 goals. And finally, and this is very directly influencing you, is the USP's role. What is our role, or what has been the role of USP valuing and protecting Pacific heritage? In my downside, I am very pessimistic about USP and heritage, Pacific heritage. But in my more optimistic times, such as this, and knowing the course coordinators of this course, I'm a bit more optimistic about USP's role, particularly the role of the Oceania Center for Arts, Culture, and Pacific Studies. You wouldn't hear about Pacific heritage, very little, from any other course that you take at USP. So I think it's a good thing that we do have some parts of USP paying attention to the heritage of the very students who make up USP. And the Pacific Heritage Hub, this is an entity that is part, or that was part of the Oceania Center. It came to life and then it started getting sick, and I think now it's almost dead. But lo and behold, we hear that some medicines have been obtained and the Pacific Heritage Hub may recover. So here's another promise good promise for the future of learning about Pacific heritage. So where do we get information about our heritage? Of course, from our communities. We know that through oral means, through storytelling. These are the so-called informal or non-formal ways that we learn about our heritage, our music and our dance and our art. some written material, and some artifacts. But those artifacts about our heritage, most of them are not in our countries. They are in the museums and the art galleries of Europe, because they were obtained in the past, okay, by those who came to discover our countries and our cultures and our heritage. But in the last 50 years, there have been some interest in our education and in our development. Also, in the written work of foreign scholars, particularly anthropologists. And we thank the anthropologists for documenting some of our heritages. Some of us think that that's, we came up with that, but that's actually them who, they documented those. However, my thinking is that today we need people like yourselves to begin researching and documenting information about our heritage using your own languages. Many scholars depended on interpreters when they did their research. I want you to one day go and conduct your own research about your own heritage. And the last few slides basically summarizes the marginalization and the lack of recognition of Pacific heritage, but particularly our knowledge systems and our value systems. It's only very recently that these have been recognized in education and in development in general. And today, surprise, surprise, the international community has declared that indigenous knowledge may be a very important source of information and solutions for the issues of climate change and sustainable development. Okay? So now we are sitting up and saying, oh, okay, we will take that and we will work on trying to not only recognize but promote our heritage, Pacific heritage. There's nothing fantastic than the international community helping us in our advocacy of things that we've always thought were important for our survival. So, in terms of the literature that's available, and UNESCO, if you go to the UNESCO website, just type heritage, you be bombarded with information about heritage. But UNESCO is on about two types, the physical, tangible heritage and the cultural, intangible heritage. Okay? That's what we read in the literature. And it talks about, in terms of tangible, tangible is what you can touch or feel. No? Intangible is what you can just imagine, can't touch it. So in terms of physical heritage, there's movable heritage, important books and documents and artifacts, clothing and so forth. And you can find some of these in museums, archives. If you go to the Fiji Museum, you would see a whole lot of movable Fijian heritage. Then there is natural heritage. Basically, the flora and fauna, which the scientists give it the fancy name of biodiversity. Okay? So if you're in the sciences and people talk about biodiversity, you would know exactly what they're talking about. But if you're in the humanities and you talk about biodiversity, one of my friends thought it was a detergent, but it's really a very important part of the science and the scientists and the ecologists. The geological features also, there's another fancy name for that, the geodiversity. Okay, so there's a lot of talk nowadays on biodiversity in the Pacific, and I will give you some readings later for you to go and read and bore yourselves with. However, I shouldn't say that, because according to my husband, biodiversity for Pacific Islanders is life. That's the word in terms of his research with Pacific Islanders. That's the word they give biodiversity. Mo'ui, life. Okay? They don't have a bio and a diversity, they just have life. Then there is cultural heritage, which is intangible, and these are the ones that are immovable heritage, like our values and our traditions, our oral history, and our language, etc. So in the literature, you'll see this. Nowadays, people talk about mixed heritage. And it's not about mixed marriages. It means mixed tangible and intangible, mixed physical and cultural. Okay? But we'll come to that later. For Pacific peoples, at least for most of the ones that I have come across and I have read about, heritage must include people. Okay? People, people, people. So we have a more holistic perspective of heritage, and there is no distinction. And you can see that by looking at your mother tongue, your vernacular, your Pacific, indigenous, even some more of the local definitions. Okay? That it's holistic, it's taken together. Like koloa to whakaholo is a combined thing. People don't separate between cultural and physical. The perspectives, of course, are linked to our cultures. Those who study our cultures say that we are more concerned about meaning and relevance rather than classification and definitions. And just to give you an example, in my teaching career, I came to realize why my students did not like English literature. There's nothing wrong with the literature. It was because they could not make meaning out of what they were supposed to learn. It wasn't relevant for them at the time. Okay? And so that was when I started to do my creative writing. I started making up verse for the students that talks about my own culture, the symbols that we use, okay? To teach them about symbolism, metaphor, simile, imagery, using things that were relevant to them and were meaningful for them. Once they learned that, they could learn all the other things, the prescribed text. And they succeeded. So for us, I'm speaking here from experience, things must have meaning and relevance, otherwise we are rote learning and we forget. This is where language is very important in making meaning. I still struggle with English. You still struggle with English because its language is very, very important in making meaning. So if our lecturers and our professors don't make things meaningful for us, well, you just nod your head and go and you cut and paste and you write paragraphs down and plagiarize, because those people write things better than you do in English. And you hand it in and wonder why you got a D+ or a C. Okay? Because really things were not meaningful to you. So understanding for us is being able to find meaning and know how to interpret this. In indigenous knowledge also, it's very important to realize that the revelation of knowledge is gradual. It's not something that you immediately know. This Piaget in education also says it's gradual and it's a different level. But for us, it's also context specific. Okay, so if I say something here in this context, okay, meaningful for you, if I say it somewhere else, it's not really very meaningful there. So different contexts, very important. And this business of the fluidity in different contexts. You know, in science and in university learning, you have to be very exact. You have to be correct. There's nothing No beating around the bush. And I remember one of my lecturers writing on my essay saying, get to the point, a big line, red line on the first couple of pages. Get to the point. Answer the question, because I'm going round and round the place for the first 2 pages, quoting from so-and-so and talking about my country. And then page 3, I start addressing the question. And then he writes, get to the point. Beating around the bush. It is not beating around the bush. This is how we talk. This is how we talk in Tonga. This is how we write there. I get up to give a speech. I don't just stand up and say, today I'm going to say this and this and this 5 minutes later and sit down. I cannot do that because people are eating. They're not listening. They're maybe half listening, but my job is to stand there and beat around the bush and say things that are irrelevant and then sit down. This fluidity is making university and school teachers go crazy. Because in formal education, we have to be exact and correct and accurate and stop beating around the bush. But people, if you're dealing with people, you have to beat around the bush. Because some people will know immediately what you're talking about, others will know 10 minutes later, others will know 10 days later, and the rest of them will never know. That's why it's so difficult to deal with Pacific peoples. Okay? And I've listed 2 readings here about people and tangible and intangible heritage. And I apologize, well, I shouldn't apologize for putting, both of these are members of my family. The first one comparing Fiji and Portugal conservation sites, that's my son, Baravi. That's an article based on his master's thesis where he compared conservation, environmental conservation in Portugal and in Fiji, in Yandua Tambu, the village that looked after the iguana, the Fiji crested iguana. In Fiji, people were involved in the decision-making and the conservation of that particular heritage site. In Portugal, people were not involved in the conservation. It was just done by the government, and the more successful approach was the one in Fiji. The last reference, and you will get copies of this, I will leave with your coordinators, an article, it's really a planned article by my husband and Eritaya from Kiribati, Whakaosi from Tonga, and it was a community-based biodiversity. See, there's the word, biodiversity surveys and conservation action plan. These are the action plans of 3 countries in relation to their heritage. So when you read those 2 articles, those are good examples of the holistic approach to heritage conservation in the Pacific. There are hundreds of other articles, but I give that to you because I don't need to go and ask for their permission to put that on Moodle for you. Well, I will ask later. So why is heritage important? Okay, the modern perspective. Heritage is important because it is a resource. Okay, it's a resource, whether it's tangible or intangible, for development. Resource for what? Well, we have seen so far why heritage is important as a resource for tourism, okay? Particularly certain kinds of landscapes that we have, or seascapes, and you see that advertised, the beaches and the kinds of landscapes that Pacific Islands have to offer. It's important for economic gain, commercial activities based on our heritage, such as mining, forestry, and fishing. I'm sure you can think of examples from your own country in terms of those and others. For entertainment, entertaining ourselves and entertaining tourists. Okay, and we've seen probably some of the most, the types of changes that have come about in terms of our dances, our music, and in terms of how we entertain. But for most indigenous people in the Pacific, heritage is their identity, is their life. It's important for teaching and learning. It's important for teaching young people about futures, the future of their communities. It's important for working towards cultural survival. Okay? Our cultures survive and continue because our young people learn about our heritage and how to move on into the future. And now, as I mentioned earlier, it is now becoming more and more important, recognized as important for sustainable development. Ensuring cultural survival and continuity. There is a book edited by Nambombo Mbamba. It's in the bookshop, Education for Sustainable Development. They consist of perspectives from around the Pacific by Pacific Islanders saying what it is, what sustainable development means to their people. And this is the Nambombo Mbamba and the editors concluded that they are saying sustainable development is ensuring cultural survival and continuity. It has to do with their culture, their heritage, and their survival. So, thirdly, I believe that heritage is important for you, for young people, because you need to get the best of both, okay? That's how, well, I'm speaking from experience. In my work, in my writing, I always try to marry, well, it's not a nice term, because people don't get married these days. I used to say that 50 years ago, and people say, oh, that's a very good symbolism, but now you need to combine. My husband used the term synergy, but that's too difficult for second language speakers. It's a synthesis. You bring the best of many worlds together and create something of your own that would reflect the best of everything. Okay? And in our own cultural heritage, we do have some very, very good things, best things. But there are some aspects of our cultures, I know there are some aspects of my culture, that I now want people to unlearn. So as an educator, I say you have to teach students to be able to learn. But you also have to teach them to be able to unlearn some of the things that we've learned from our cultures that are not really, really very good for the world or for even our culture to move along. Okay? Many of the prejudices I learned growing up as a child in Tonga, I don't want my children to learn. Right? Prejudice against certain groups. So, having said that about the Pacific, let's see why we are so interested in heritage. And it's really coming to us. We've always been interested in our own heritage, but now there's a whole global movement about the importance of heritage. And UNESCO has been the driving force in this interest. 1972, before many of you were born, they had a big conference there. And it was decided that cultural and natural heritage must be protected throughout the world. So now there are lots of what they call World Heritage Sites. Okay? Most of them cultural, as opposed to natural, and some of them mixed. In 1998, UNESCO also had a meeting and created a convention on oral and intangible heritage. This is about our oral traditions and our values, those things we can't touch. So there is a convention on that. And some of Pacific Island countries have signed into that. My country, for example, signed into that. Not that they're doing very much these days, but they signed the document. Then we have now some heritage sites. Of the near 1,000, we have 11. I'll show you in the next slide. We also have the Pacific Festival of Arts. That's one regional approach in protecting our cultural heritage. Usually, USP used to send a group to this Festival of Arts, mainly from OCAC and Pacific Studies. I don't know about the one last year, whether they sent any. Then there are all these national heritage movements. Every country now in the Pacific are signing up and saying to the world, we will protect our national heritage, which is very easy in countries such as mine in Tonga, because there's one Tongan culture, but very difficult for multicultural countries such as Fiji, for example, okay? Because they would need to sit down and decide how they're going to, which heritage to protect. Here are the sites. I don't want to read them out. You can study them. 11 of them so far. The latest was in Raiatea in French Polynesia, Tapu Atea, and you notice that Levuka is also listed. That is Fiji's World Heritage Site. Not very many from our region. We could have a lot more. We'll talk about why in a minute. So you can study that list. And we are getting towards the end now. So we know we have a different perspective. We know our heritage is important. We know the work we need to do. And we know that we are signing up to this global movement to protect our heritage. But I hope it's not just because it's coming from UNESCO. I hope it's something that we feel strongly about, that we need to protect our heritage, Pacific heritage. Not just for academic reasons, but just because it's our heritage. If you don't protect your own heritage, who is going to do that? Here are some of the issues. The issue of repatriation. I said earlier that many important artifacts have been moved to museums and art galleries in Europe because these were obtained by the early missionaries, by the early explorers, by the early administrators they took. And in some ways, it was good they took them, because if they left them, I know if they left them in Tonga, they probably have disappeared by now. Last year, my son, who lives in Spain, took my husband and I to the American Museum of Contemporary Arts. And there was this helu, this comb, that was made by one of my ancestors. And hence the name. My middle name, Helu, is comb, C-O-M-B. You know what you used to comb your hair? Helu means comb. And one of my ancestors made this beautiful comb for the king, for the Tuitonga, way, way, way back in the 18th century. Well, it's sitting in a museum in Spain, for goodness sake. So I had to take a picture to show all my relatives in Tonga, because they've never seen the helu. Okay? So it's just going to sit there. The Maoris of New Zealand have asked for repatriation of their artifacts from museums all over Europe, and they have received them. Okay? But there is this question of, are we going to leave our artifacts there? That's part of my heritage. Is it going to sit there? Or should we bring it to Tonga? Should we bring it to USP? I don't know. But that's a big issue. The management of heritage is also very important. The reason we do not have lots of World Heritage sites, I believe, is because we don't have our own people trained to fill in those forms. And you know, if you want a World Heritage site, you better learn how to fill in forms, many, many forms. Okay? Who wants to do that in the Pacific? I hate it. I don't like people sending me a questionnaire that's more than 1 page long. Sitting down and filling the forms, visiting the site, knowing what to do, writing to UNESCO. We lack those professionals in the Pacific. Otherwise, we would have double the number of World Heritage Sites. But thank God, Oceania's Center for Arts and Culture and Pacific Studies from next year will offer a certificate level qualification in heritage management. So hopefully, in the future, some of you may be the ones writing to UNESCO and filling in all those forms to make a heritage site in your country one of the world's World Heritage Sites. There's also the issue of property rights and laws. This is very, very, very difficult. In Fiji, for example, things are collectively owned. The Itauke culture, land is not owned by one person, like in Tonga, where I come from. Tonga is the only country in the Pacific where land is individualized long time ago, not collective. It was collective, and thanks to the British, they came and introduced their laws of individual land ownership. So now, you could be a poor farmer, but you own a piece of land. And you can't buy land in Tonga. There's no freehold land there. In Fiji, land is collectively owned. You want to develop that piece of land, you don't talk to one person or two persons or three persons. You have to sit down with the clan and talk and talk and talk. And you may not reach an agreement. It's very frustrating if you're a businessman who wants to build a jetty or you want to build a hotel. So understand that. The Fijians understand that, but most other people don't. So you have to learn how to deal with property rights of those whose notion of rights are different from yours. There's heritage tourism. Here is a major income for some of our countries. Right? Number one money earner in Fiji. But how is tourism impacting our heritage, the changes that have come about? I have seen Tongan dancing at the Westin by a group from the West, and I couldn't recognize that that was Tongan dancing. It was Fijian dancing with some hand movement. So that kind of impact that tourism has on our cultures, is that good? Should we let them continue doing that, or we try and get them to do the right thing? Get some authenticity into it. That's a debatable question. There's economic exploitation of our natural heritage, and you are quite familiar with that living in Fiji. The mining operations, the forestry operations, people quarreling whether we should cut the sandalwood or not. Okay? That kind of conversation is worth thinking about. Then there is virtual heritage now that you are all digital experts. We can preserve things nowadays through discs, okay? But then we have the issues of intellectual property rights. Who has rights to those kinds of information? So we do need more heritage sites, I think, not because UNESCO says so, but because we say so. And we need for more of our people to protect. You protect what is yours. You can get somebody else to protect it, but it's not as good as you protecting it and managing it. Other issues relating to the proclamation on intangible heritage, and this is the difficult bit. Tangible heritage, it's easy to protect. Intangible ones, not so easy. And there are issues related to that. Ethnic discrimination. Many Pacific cultures thrive on ethnic discrimination. Maybe, don't tell anyone. I might be arrested for saying that. That's not a nice thing to say about our cultures, but we do. In my language, there are words that we use to discriminate against people who are not Tongan. Sociologists will tell you that. There's a term that they use to describe that kind of behavior. It's called phenophalism. I won't write it down, it's not a good word, so don't Just know there is a word and don't remember it. And I'm sure all cultures have that. You know, the words that we use just among ourselves to describe people of other cultures and other ethnic groups. Oh, that's it, just so and so. Yeah? But that's discrimination. Nowadays, if we use those, we'll get arrested. But it's a reality, and maybe we should try to address that issue when we're talking about intangible heritage, because that is part of our intangible heritage. Lack of government support throughout the Pacific. We talk and talk and talk until the cows come home about climate change, biodiversity conservation, heritage conservation, core values, but we don't see much action, whether it's government or non-government. We don't see it. So there is a lack of support for especially for intangible heritage. Now, here's another point for which I will be very unpopular. Centuries of missionary work has denied the importance of some aspects of our heritage. Okay? When the missionaries came, they didn't even think we had an education system. Okay? We did. We had an education, a very working education system. And we had gods. We had lots and lots of gods. Okay? We had lots of good beliefs. We were spiritual people, but we were told that we were heathens. And so a lot of work by them have been fantastic, like the writing down of our languages, thanks to them. Teaching our languages in school, thanks to them. But no thanks to them, we had other beliefs and other aspects of our cultures that were important, that were totally annihilated. Someone just said to me the other day, I didn't know that you had great carvers in Tonga. I didn't know that you had great tattooing people in Tonga. We had all of that, but they were obliterated. We had dances in Tonga that are only performed by people in Laos. It's lost from Tonga, okay? Because they were banned by the missionaries. So I have to go to Laos to see this ancient Tongan dance performed. That is part of my heritage. So, years of, not just by missionary, but other people, denying the important aspect of some of our heritage. There is also competition from contemporary types of entertainment, and you know very well what that means. Okay? I go to the gym, fitness center here, and I hear, you know, how they play music while I'm trying to exercise. And I say to the girl there, can you put on some music, some Fijian music for me? And she looked at me and says, but there's music. I said, no, that's noise. That's modern music. I couldn't hear the lyrics. I didn't know what it was about. That's contemporary types of entertainment interfering. So you could still have that, you know, a nice Fijian song and not have noise. Anyway, that's my prejudice. And then there's, of course, the lack of awareness in our schools, including in our universities and in the mainstream media. All right? Because if we're not aware that our heritage is important, you're not going to write about it, you're not going to teach about it, and you will make fun of those who do. So, your task for homework is look at any of those issues and see whether you can come up with a solution for a way forward in addressing the issue that you have selected. Because you're all very bright people who can help address some of these issues. So, that's my little conclusion. Pacific perspective of heritage is holistic. I think that's easy to know. We don't separate between physical and you know, that's part of our knowledge systems. You know, in the West, they're very smart, you know, making things easy for them. Western knowledge systems, they compartmentalize knowledge into the sciences, the humanities, the social sciences, and within each of those categories, there's more more breakdown. It makes it easy to think about certain things, you know. We just lump everything together, okay, and say, yeah, that's knowledge. We don't separate. We do not compartmentalize knowledge. And even, you know, what we learn about cognitive, affective, you know, feelings and thinking in most Pacific indigenous societies, you think with your stomach. You feel with your ngaka, with your intestines. Cook Island Maori, they talk about not the heart, you know, not, you know, love stories about, you know, love coming from the heart. No, love in the Cook Islands come from their ngaka, from their inside. Okay, so a holistic approach is very, very good in some contexts and very, very difficult in another context. So there are pros and cons when we look at our own Pacific perspectives and we compare that with foreign, non-Pacific ones. But I believe we can bring these together and create something that is acceptable and useful in terms of conserving our heritage in the first place. So here there are some useful references, and as I said, I'll give the 2 readings to the course coordinators, and you can read up in terms of trying to do this synthesis that I'm talking about, bringing the natural and the physical together and involving people in conservation, in heritage conservation. So with that, thank you for being polite and sitting there and pretending to listen to me.